A World History of Christianity, beginning in Chapter 5. India. R. E. Frykenberg. The arrival or rising presence of Christians in India was neither sudden nor simple. The spread of Christian belief and congregations within the continent or subcontinent of India, moreover, is still an ongoing, uneven process. This process is believed to have begun nearly 2,000 years ago, stretching from circa 52 to the present. No single arrival marks a clear standing point. Broken bits or shards of the gospel came in small increments. Believers also emerged one by one, and sometimes in clusters. Each new presence was different in dimension and texture. Main features of this development can be conveniently, if arbitrarily, divided into three conventional categories. For simplicity, identifying waves of Christian arrival as ancient, medieval, and modern corresponds roughly to Thomas, including Babylonian, Chaldean, Syrian Orthodox, Catholic, Roman, and evangelical, Protestant phases. These terms themselves suggest kinds of particularity in relation to the universality of Christian history. Thomas Christians are the oldest and most narrowly focused. Catholic and evangelical Christians each have possessed distinctive attributes which, in normative terms, might be applied to Christians almost anywhere. What began as a small and thin stream of Christian presence in Malabar and Mylapore, peoples claiming descent from converts of the Apostle Thomas, has been joined and mingled in complex ways by innumerable later accretions. Each later arrival, moreover, has generated its own kind of internal reformation, revival, or reawakening. Each also has brought some further particularity or specificity. Obviously, however, as these waves of arrival have turned into ongoing streams and rivers, attention cannot be focused upon all at the same time. The procedure followed here is to assume ongoing but developmental processes within each tradition, even though all details cannot be specified. More concentrated attention is focused upon each new arrival or development at the time of its occurrence. First waves of arrival, the Thomas Christians. The antiquity of Christian communities in India, along with the origins of Christian institutions, is not easy to identify, trace, or understand. Questions of historicity and antiquity are matters of amazing complexity, with answers coming from the south and north, east and west. The southern and/or eastern traditions stress maritime origins, while northern and western traditions tend rather to the overland. Yet before either can be examined more closely, it is useful to appreciate how peoples of India have themselves produced, preserved, and perpetuated their own unique forms of historical understanding. This understanding is here woven into the story. That Christians of India have tended to fashion their own historical understandings in ways comparable to those of other peoples of India is hardly strange. They have preserved their own Itihasa Puranas and their own Vamshavalis. Family members have told and retold their own stories about how the lineages in their own communities first came into being, settled in their own places, and developed their own institutions. Their own traditions have indicated that the Apostle Thomas came by sea from Arabia and landed on the Malabar coast. Alternatively, they have shown that he came overland, down from the north. Details of arrival and subsequent events have been celebrated in song and verse for generations untold. Lyrical sagas, such as the Margam Kali Patu, the Riban Patu, and the Tama Parvam, tell about the coming of the way of the Son of God. Distilled to essentials, these sources indicate that the apostle, after staying in Malabar, sailed around the Cape of Kanyakumari and up the Coromandel coast, that he stopped at Mylapore, now within the city of Madras, recently named Chennai, and that after going on to China, he returned, circa 52 through 58 CE, to Malabar, settled in Tiruvanchikulam, near Cranganore, and established congregations at Malankara, Chayal, Kokamangalam, Niranam, Paravur, Kota Kayal, Palayur, and Keelan. Finally, they indicate that, having trained leaders, acharyas, and gurus from high caste families for each congregation, the apostle departed from Malabar for the last time, circa 69, leaving behind a strong, self-propagating, and self-sustaining community. One poetic source goes so far as to give a demographic and social breakdown, Varnashramadharma, of lineage groups, castes, making up this earliest Christian community, namely 6,850 Brahmins, 2,800 Kshatriyas, 3,750 Vaishyas, and 4,250 Shudras. Significantly, no mention is made of what others, i.e. aboriginals or untouchables, Adivasis or Dalits in today's argot, might also have become Christians. Such groups, in terms of Hindu traditions, would not have been worth counting. What were worth counting were miraculous healings and deliverances performed by the apostle, 94 from death, 260 from devils, 230 from leprosy, 220 from paralysis, and 250 from blindness. Oral traditions and palm leaf, copperplate, and stone inscriptions preserved by leading families who claimed descent from Brahmin and Nayar lineages record details concerning the migrations, habitations, and places visited by the apostle. These, according to Placid Padapara, one of many authorities who have devoted years to studying Thomas Christian texts, make clear that many families of Kerala still trace their conversion to the time of the apostle or to any number of migrations which occurred for many centuries prior to the arrival of the Portuguese in 1498. Vamshevalis, lineage histories, claim hereditary clerical authority as katanars, pastors, or as local metrans, bishops or elders, on the basis of apostolic succession going back to Thomas, and contain as many as 50, 60, or even 70 unbroken generations of office holders. Leading families claiming such distinction are Kali, Kalake, Katakali, Kayakam, Madhyapur, Mutal, Nedumpali, Pakalomatam, Panakamatam, and Sankarapuri. Artifacts, especially stone crosses and monuments preserved by Katanar families and villages, further reinforce or vindicate claims of hoary antiquity and distinction. Apostolic baptisms near one ancient building at Palayur prompted Brahmins to avoid pollution by bathing or drinking at an older temple tank. All these traditions take the story further, indicating that Thomas returned to Mylapore perhaps in 69 CE. They tell how a local Raja imprisoned Thomas when money entrusted to him for constructing a palace was distributed to the poor, how the Raja's brother, who had just died, was restored to life in order to tell his sibling of the heavenly palaces which the apostle had just built, and finally how the brother's testimony had convinced the Raja and 700 members of his court to accept the gospel and become baptized. Yet another story indicates that the apostle's days subsequently came to a dramatic end when, while walking near Little Mount, he was confronted by Brahmins leading a procession for the purpose of a blood sacrifice to the goddess Kali. The apostle, refusing to join the event, so infuriated the crowd that it attacked and slew him, piercing his side with a three-pronged lance, trishul or trident. A prayer alleged to have come from the martyr's lips as he died is still regularly sung by Thomas Christians on 3 July each year to commemorate the historic arrival and mission of the apostle to India. Traditions relating to the burial place of the apostle, whether in Mylapore itself, which seems unlikely, or at the little white shrine which now adorns the top of the hill for which for centuries uncounted has been known as St. Thomas Mount, continue to give special saliency to this indigenous form of apostolic Christianity in India. Many centuries before the Portuguese arrival, healing powers were attributed to this shrine and its surroundings, even to the dust on its footpaths. Whatever the historicity of such indigenous traditions, there can be no question as to their great antiquity or to their great appeal in popular imagination. Such imaginings are certainly as strong as those supporting claims concerning the rise of early Christian communities in various parts of Europe. The oldest literary account of the apostles' missionary work in India is found in the Acts of Thomas. This document is of unknown origin, language, or provenance. Its earliest surviving versions, which are in Syriac, have enabled scholars to trace it at least to 4th century Edessa. These clearly show from their content and contextual detail that the document itself could have originated in the 2nd century. This wonderfully colorful narrative, while mingling allegory and romance, also depicts actual people and places. The story itself, repeated in various forms and venues, commences in the upper room, with apostolic responses to the Great Commission: go into all the world and preach the gospel. The 11, after dividing the world into regions and drawing lots over who should go where, assigned India to Thomas the twin, Didymus. When Thomas objected, saying that a Jew would have trouble communicating with Indians, his brother apostles turned to prayer, hoping that God would bring about a change of heart in Thomas. At that moment, even while prayers were rising, a royal commissioner of Gundaforus arrived in Jerusalem. His name was Aban, and his mission was to recruit a master builder who could build a palace for his royal master. Thomas was a master builder or carpenter, stone being more plentiful in the area than wood. He had served his apprenticeship as a disciple of Jesus. Such were his credentials that he was immediately offered the task. The offer being too good to refuse, royal agent and apostle set off together on the long journey back to India. Many were the strange and wonderful adventures which befell them along the way. In Andropolis, for example, a Jewish flute girl became the apostles' first convert. Then, when the king's daughter proclaimed faith in Christ on her wedding day, and then refused to participate in the ceremony, a hasty departure had to be made to avert the royal wrath of her father. On their reaching India, King Gundaforus advanced funds for the new palace. Thomas, disturbed by the miserable plight of countless poor and by the profligate luxury of the rich, felt compelled to distribute all the funds to alleviate suffering. When the king returned from his journey and asked for a glimpse of his new palace, he was told that it was being built in heaven, and that on earth Thomas had given funds to the poor, all the while teaching about a new God, healing the sick, driving out demons, and doing wonderful things in the name of the new God of whom he was preaching. Acts of Thomas 1, 1920, paraphrased here. Outraged, the king threw Thomas and Aban into prison. That very night, however, the king's brother Gad died and went to heaven where, beholding the glorious palace which Thomas had built for his brother, he begged for a chance to tell his brother what he had seen. This boon being granted, the king heard his brother's words, perhaps in a dream, and immediately became a believer together with many others. All received 3 signs of grace from the apostle: anointing with oil, the seal; baptism, the added seal; and communion, bread and wine of the Eucharist. Acts of Thomas 2:22-27. Deacons and elders were trained to lead the new congregation. After this, the apostle again set off and established congregations in other parts of India before meeting his death in the realm of King Mazdai on the eastern coast. His radical teachings against marriage brought about the conversion of many women, including the queen. When she forsook her marriage bed for the sake of piety, her royal husband became so enraged that he ordered Thomas's immediate execution. The apostle, facing the spears of his executioners at a mount just outside the city, then prayed, "My Lord and my God, my hope and Redeemer, I have fulfilled your work and accomplished your command. I have been bound, but today I receive freedom." Acts of Thomas 13:167, John 20:28. Whether this romantic tale of questionable historicity contains any residue of historical substance, we shall never know. But we do know that Gundaforus and Gad ruled an empire on both sides of the Indus during the years 19 to 45 CE, years when the apostle could well have carried the gospel to that part of the world. Traders, settlers, and refugees came from the west to the shores of India. They came in small groups over many centuries. Commercial relations between the Indian and Roman worlds had increased with the discovery of seasonal monsoon winds, which steadily blew ships to India during certain months and then blew them back to Africa and Arabia. Both Strabo and the Periplus, a mariner's manual written about the time of Thomas, circa 50-73, describes fleets with ships of up to 7 sails and 300 tons, which moved back and forth across the Arabian Sea. Roman peace brought increasing traffic and prosperity. Romans built colonies on the coasts of India, and Indians moved into Egyptian marketplaces where Greeks and Arabs, Jews and Syrians, Armenians and Persians benefited. Sanskrit and Tamil epics mentioned Yavana, Greek, ships, laden with glass, gold, and horses, which returned with gems, ivory, pepper, exotic animals, and birds, especially peacocks. Greek workmen were used to build a Chola palace. Whatever the historicity of the Thomas story, historical evidence confirms that comparable events did happen, so that items in the story are plausible. Hints of early Christian presence in India are found in writings which date only a century or two later than the 73 CE date for Thomas's death, preserved in local traditions. From Alexandria, citadel of early Christian learning, a remarkably gifted Jewish scholar and Christian convert named Pantaenus, mentor of Clement and Origen, determined to preach Christ to the Brahmins and philosophers. According to Eusebius, he went as far as India and found that Matthew's gospel had arrived before him and was in the hands of some there who had come to know Christ. Whether this was the real India to which Pantaenus went cannot be determined. However, Brahmins mentioned by Jerome could hardly have come from anywhere but India. Moreover, Jewish communities such as the Beni Israel, perhaps dating back to the first exile, were already settled along the coasts of India, and more Jews also arrived after the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, and again in 136. It seems clear that Christian and Jewish communities were already settled along the shores of the subcontinent from the 2nd century onwards. Evidence of links between Christians in Parthian Persia and in Edessa, now Urfa, in modern Turkey, is strong. Due to the religious pluralism of Parthian rulers, Christians were able to organize a religious community and to become an important minority within the Persian Empire. They were mainly middle-class families who were well off, known for their medicine, science, and trusted positions within the government. Edessa, the capital of a tiny principality known as Ashron, lay between the empires of Rome and Parthia. Often squeezed by one power or the other, it became a leading center of Christian culture. Its language, an Aramaic dialect known as Syriac, became the literary and liturgical language for all Eastern Assyrian, Chaldean, and Persian Christians. Its theological scholars became famous. It was there that Tatian, born circa 150, wrote his polemic against Greek cultural dominance over Christian institutions and his Diatessaron, or Harmony of the Gospels, for long the only gospel used in the East but condemned in the West. During the reign of Abgar VIII, circa 190, Christians of Edessa and Persia became caught up in controversies with Christians of the West over the date of Easter. When the Romans conquered Edessa in 216, Christians of Mesopotamia and Persia were again caught in the middle and became increasingly suspect. Ardashir, founder of the Sasanian dynasty in 226 and restorer of Zoroastrian religious dominance, reconquered Edessa and Syria in 258, capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian. Zoroastrian priests, Mobeds, mounted virulent campaigns against Christians. Calamity struck on Good Friday, 17 April 341, in Seleucia Ctesiphon, the twin cities bestriding the Tigris. Catholicos Simon Bar Sabai and over 100 prominent Christian leaders of the empire were put to death by Shapur II. Years of martyrdom and suffering followed. After the promulgation of Yezgard's Edict of Toleration circa 401, comparable to the Edict of Constantine 85 years earlier, the Persian Church enjoyed a time of restoration. This reached its zenith under the ecclesiastical rule of the Catholicos Isaac, Grand Metropolitan and head of all bishops. But theological disputes in the West led to a permanent rift with Eastern Christians. Theologians at Edessa and throughout the Sasanian Empire, beyond the boundaries of Byzantium, rejected the Council of Ephesus and its view of Mary as Theotokos, or Mother of God. After 431, ties with the West became weaker and the Patriarchate of Babylon, or the Church of the East, held sway among Christians in Persia and India. A century before Eastern Christians fell beneath the shadow of Islam, an Indian traveler from the island of Socotra, with the Greek name Cosmas Indicopleustis, wrote a travelogue entitled Christian Topography, circa 535. This work shows that he found Syrian Christian bishops and communities along the coasts of India and Sri Lanka. By then, wars between Sasanian kings and Eastern Roman rulers of Byzantium had brought more waves of refugees to India, and political pressures in Persia prompted a further severance of bonds with the West. By then, also, the Patriarch of Babylon had long claimed ecclesiastical authority over Malabar Christians. The term Nestorian, as applied to all Christians of India at the end of the 6th century, was as much a matter of ecclesiastical and geographical distinction as it was a term applied to doctrine or ritual. Missionary ventures across Asia and into China continued to grow well into the 13th century, but Muslim expansion in the 7th century cut the East off from Byzantium and the West more effectively than any previous event. By diminishing communication, it closed off occasions for theological or ecclesiastical contact or conciliation. The question of why Christianity disappeared so completely from Persia, as also from certain parts of Arabia, remains unanswered. At least two factors may have played an important part in this disappearance. First, in both Syrian and Persian forms of Christianity, after coming out of Antioch and later stemming out of Edessa, language was allowed to come between clerical leadership and ordinary believers. The language of the church, Syriac, a form of Aramaic, became the exclusive preserve of the learned and literate, the only vehicle for liturgy through which the gospel and biblical literature was transmitted from one generation to the next. In Persia and other lands to the east, Syriac was not the tongue of the common people. Efforts made to translate some scripture, sermons, and religious discourses, especially hymns, into Pahlavi were not effective, and for the most part the language of the church remained foreign and could not be understood by the less learned or less literate. Persians had long held a great affection for the beauty of their language. The failure of Christians to use Persian for purposes of faith, worship, and scholarship left an enormous cultural void and residual ignorance, a gulf which could not easily be bridged. Second, Christianity in the East became increasingly, if not predominantly, monastic in character and celibate in normative social doctrines. As a consequence, very little is known about the daily life of the ordinary Christian believer in Persia or in other Eastern lands. While extraordinary missionary efforts and ventures were undertaken, carrying the gospel to China and India, if not to islands beyond, both the faith and the faithful became increasingly isolated and regulated. Strict celibacy was equated with spirituality. Some even suggested that celibacy might be mandatory for gaining eternal salvation. The Persian sage, Aphrodites, had written as early as the 4th century that Christians were divided into two groups: the offspring of the covenant, Bar Kiyama, and the penitents, emphasizing that only those dedicated to an ascetic and celibate life could be baptized, while those who were not so inclined were denied baptism. This virtually Manichaean separation between the tiny elite and the masses, between those dwelling in the light and those consigned to living in darkness, coming at a time when the church faced a strong and hostile state religion that inflicted persecutions over long periods of time, greatly weakened the Christian community and left it vulnerable. And while the bar between marriage and baptism did not last, the strict rules of the Bar Kiyama continued to be upheld, with celibacy, prolonged periods of fasting and prayer, vows of poverty, simplicity of food and garb, ceaseless study and silence. Such world-renouncing was not attractive to Zoroastrians. Such ways were viewed as blasphemy against life itself. Ironically, with the coming of Islam, both Christians and Zoroastrians were marginalized in Persia. Sunni Islam, at least initially, was averse to asceticism and elitism alike, striving to obliterate all distinctions between the religious and not so religious, between specialists and ordinary people. Only Armenian Christians, coming from the homelands and strongholds to the north and west, managed to maintain a clear identity in Islamic lands. Armenians became a striving Christian community thriving within the Islamicized societies of the East in the centuries which followed. From an Indian perspective, processes by which Christians, either as refugees or as settlers and traders, had been coming to the western shores of India at various times for many centuries, both before and after the rise of Islam, can be documented. Such waves can sometimes be dated by looking at grants of land and privileges which Christians received. These grants, certified or deeded documents on copper, stone, or palm leaf, were often later embellished and reinforced in oral traditions. One such tradition indicates that, as early as 293, a great persecution occurred within the Chola kingdom.
Cholamandalam along the east coast. That 76 families fled to Malabar and settled among Christians of Quilon, and that some refugees came under the influence of a sectarian Tamil Shaiva, presumably Bhakti, teacher, insomuch that disputes arose over religious rites, such as smearing ashes on the forehead and venerating the 5 products of the cow. In the year 345, not long after the great persecutions of Christians within the Persian Empire had begun, a community of Syrian Christians landed on the Malabar coast under the leadership of an Armenian merchant banker named Thomas of Cana. Cana was cordially welcomed by the local king, Sheriman Perumal, and given special privileges, formal grants certified in copper plate and stone inscriptions, which specified exactly which lands his settlers were to occupy and which prerogatives of high status they were to enjoy. The deeds indicate that Syrian Christians were sought after and highly valued along the Malabar coast. As enterprising traders, their activities generated prosperity wherever they settled. Syriac documents indicate that it was the Catholicos of Babylon who sent Thomas of Jerusalem, alias Thomas of Cana, and that when he arrived at Malankara, he was accompanied by a bishop, deacons, and a group of men, women, and children. The process of separation between East and West, which increased after the rise and expansion of Islam, brought many more Christian refugees across the Arabian Sea, fleeing from persecution in lands immediately to the west and north. A late 8th century copper plate in Kottayam indicates that a grant was given by a king named Veera Raghavan Chakravarthi to a Christian leader named Ivari Korthan. Another set of 5 plates known as the Tarisapali Persian Christian plates, 2 in Thiruvala and 3 in Kottayam, shows that privileges were granted by Aryan Aigil of Vinad to Marwan Savriso of Tir early in the following century, circa 825, and later that King Ayan of Venkat, southern Travancore, circa 880, granted privileges to Tarisa, Persian Christians, to Ajunanam, Jews, and Manigramam, trade guild members, many being Christians. Lands given were demarcated in the traditional manner by letting a female elephant roam free, and leaders were granted self-government, protection, corvée labor, and bride price privileges.
Quite clearly, the different Christian communities which evolved in Malabar became, for the most part, an aristocratic elite. Hindu in culture, Christian in faith, and Syrian or Nestorian in doctrine, ecclesiology, and ritual, these Christians constituted a complex of high caste communities whose occupational position, ritual purity, and social ranking as merchant traders became ever more firmly fixed and well-grounded. Within a Brahmanically framed social order of a 4-class or 4-color system, most Christians fell somewhere between Kshatriya and Vaishya. Christian cultures, not all being of the same caste or lineage, Vamsha, were far from uniform, yet all possessed features which were distinctly native to the land or Hindu in that sense of the term. A new husband would tie a thali around his bride's neck and perform a ceremonial of investiture of marriage cloth. Some of the most exclusive, who claimed a pure lineal descent from Thomas of Cana, wore a tonsure. This elite, known as the Malankara Nazaranis, seems to have paralleled Nayars in the nature of their relations with Brahmins and with each other. Their places of dwelling were referred to as Theraved, and their rituals for removing pollution from ghee and gur, as with food and drink and utensils, were very similar. Even in matters of interdining and intermarriage, as also in disposal of dead bodies, Nayars and Thomas, or Syrian Christians, became linked. Indeed, as wealthy merchant bankers and traders whose transactions and travels called for armed protection by skilled warriors, the same kinds of training in martial sciences were given to boys of both communities. According to the Villarvatom Pena, Malankara Nazaranis scattered across Kerala even went so far as to form their own little kingdom, a domain or realm of authority stretching north and south along the coast, with its capital at Mahadevapatnam, port of the great god, on the island of Chenamangalam. This was later moved to Udayamperur so as to avoid Arab depredations. The Udayamperur church's place of worship was built, according to Christian tradition, by the Raja of Villarvatom, circa 510, and the kingdom seems to have survived until after the coming of the Portuguese. Only then, after receiving promises of help to defend themselves from Arabs, were the Malankara Christians betrayed and partially conquered, but they were never completely subdued. In the centuries which followed, and right down to the present, these earliest expressions of indigenous Christianity, to be found anywhere in the subcontinent, in both ideological and institutional forms, survived. At least 6 communities still claim the apostolic tradition of St. Thomas as the historic basis both for their origin and for their doctrinal and ecclesiastical authority. These 6 groups, as found today, are the Orthodox Syrian Church in 2 branches, the Independent Syrian Church of Malabar, Kulam, the Mar Thoma Church, the Malankara Syrian Rite Catholic Church, the Chaldean Church of the East, and the St. Thomas Evangelical Church, or factions thereof, along with formerly CMS segments within the Church of South India. Virtually all these groups or branches and sub-communities thereof interacted from the 16th century onward with representatives of the Roman Catholic Church. As such, they either answered to or resisted the authority of the Portuguese Padroedo in Goa, or directly communicated with the Congregatio di Propaganda Fide in Rome.